The village of Windmere was shrouded in an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional caw of the crows that had made the area their dominion. The air felt heavier as Jane parked her old car at the edge of the woods, where the twisted trees loomed like sentinels guarding a forgotten secret. The locals had been reluctant to share much about the black eyes of the forest, as they called the crows, but their expressions, tight-lipped and wide-eyed, had told her enough. Something about these birds, their unflinching gaze and their ominous presence, had turned this otherwise serene countryside into a place of unease. As Jane stepped into the forest, a chill crawled up her spine. The dense canopy above swallowed the sunlight, plunging the surroundings into a dim, unnatural gloom. The sound of her boots crunching on the dry leaves felt deafening in the oppressive quiet. Yet, beneath her own footsteps, there was something else, a faint, rhythmic rustling. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't her. The noise seemed to follow her, staying just out of reach. Suddenly, a crow let out a piercing caw from a low branch ahead, startling her. Its glossy black eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, as if assessing her worth. Jane's chest tightened as she noticed something odd. The bird's feathers seemed to shimmer faintly, as though they were wet with something other than dew. She tried to shake the feeling of dread, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But as she moved deeper into the woods, more crows appeared, gathering on branches, stumps, and even on the forest floor. Their silence was more terrifying than their calls. Then she saw it, half buried in the dirt, a small wooden object, intricately carved into the shape of a crow. Its surface was weathered, yet the eyes of the carving seemed polished, unnervingly lifelike. Jane hesitated before picking it up, but something about it drew her closer, like a whisper in her mind urging her to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed against the smooth wood, a jolt of cold shot through her arm, and the forest seemed to breathe around her. The trees creaked as if they were alive, their twisted branches forming shadowy hands against the dim light. The faint rustling she'd heard earlier grew louder, now unmistakably circling her. She spun around, her breath quickening, but saw nothing, only the crows watching intently, as though they were waiting for something. And then she heard it, her name, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Jane. It was barely more than a whisper, but it froze her in place. Her mind raced. How could anyone know her name here? The voice didn't sound human. It had a distorted, echoing quality, as if it came from the very trees themselves. Her grip on the wooden crow tightened, and the air around her seemed to grow colder. She turned in every direction, searching for the source of the voice, but the forest offered no answers. Only shadows that seemed to shift and crawl when she wasn't looking. Finally, she stepped back, intending to retreat to the safety of her car. But as she turned, she froze. The path she had taken into the woods was gone. In its place was a dense wall of trees, their branches interwoven like a barrier, cutting off her escape. The crows stirred, their wings fluttering softly as if mocking her. And just beyond them, deeper into the forest, she spotted a faint glow, a sickly green light flickering like a flame. It beckoned her forward, daring her to follow. Jane's heart pounded as she realized there was no way out but forward. And so, with trembling hands and the wooden crow clutched tightly, she stepped toward the glow, feeling the weight of countless unseen eyes upon her. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around her like a dark chant. Each step felt like a descent into something ancient, something wrong. As she neared the light, the forest seemed to pulse, alive with an energy that made her skin crawl. The crows began to caw in unison, their cries rising to a deafening crescendo, and Jane realized too late that she had crossed a threshold. Whatever lay ahead wasn't just watching her, it was waiting. Jane's steps faltered as she moved closer to the sickly green glow ahead. The wooden crow in her hand felt heavier now, almost as if it were alive, pulsing faintly against her skin. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the unnatural pull that seemed to guide her deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder, fragmented words swirling in the air around her like the remnants of a broken spell. Then, as if triggered by her thoughts, fragments of an old memory began to surface, a memory she had buried so deeply that it felt like an invasion. She saw herself as a child, no older than 7, sitting on the floor of her dimly lit bedroom. Outside the window, 3 crows sat in eerie silence, their beady black eyes fixated on her. Her mother's voice echoed in the memory, soft and melodic, singing a lullaby Jane hadn't heard in years. But there was something unsettling about the song, a minor chord that felt out of place, like a secret woven into the melody. Her mother's face appeared, calm but distant, as if she were looking through Jane rather than at her. And then the memory shifted. Her mother had turned abruptly to the window, staring at the crows with an expression of pure dread. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had come, leaving Jane with an overwhelming sense of unease. Her mother had never spoken of that night again, nor of her disappearance only weeks later. But now, in the heart of this cursed forest, the same lullaby began to play faintly in her mind. The melody was distant but unmistakable, each note dragging her deeper into a pit of forgotten fear. Ahead, the green light flickered again, revealing something partially hidden beneath a gnarled tree root, a small, tattered journal. Jane hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling as she flipped open the fragile cover. The pages were filled with jagged handwriting, almost as if the author had been in a frenzy. The ink had bled in places, but one line stood out, written over and over again: "The crows are the watchers. The crows are the key." As she turned another page, a faded photograph fell to the ground. Jane's blood ran cold as she picked it up. It was an old picture of her mother, standing in front of the very woods she now found herself in. Her mother's expression was hauntingly neutral, her eyes hollow, and in the background, perched ominously on the branches, were countless crows. Beneath the photograph, written in the same jagged script, was a single word: sacrifice. Jane's breathing quickened as the weight of the revelation hit her. Her mother had been here, in this exact forest, long before Jane's childhood memory of the crows at the window. Questions swirled in her mind. Why had her mother never spoken of this place? What connection did she have to the crows? And why had she disappeared so suddenly all those years ago? The whispers grew louder now, almost tangible, wrapping around her like a cold wind. They no longer felt random. They were words, fragmented but urgent, spoken in her mother's voice. "Jane, don't look back, don't let them in." The warning was clear, but it only deepened her confusion. Don't look back at what? Don't let who in? Before she could gather her thoughts, the wooden crow in her hand pulsed again, sending another memory crashing into her mind. She was back in her childhood bedroom, but this time, the crows at the window were moving, pecking at the glass with growing intensity. Her mother rushed into the room, snatching Jane up and whispering in a panicked voice, "They've come for us. Don't make a sound." The memory shattered as a branch snapped behind her, jerking Jane back to the present. Her heart raced as she turned sharply, but there was no one there, just the shadows, shifting unnaturally between the trees. The lullaby returned, louder now, resonating through the forest as though the trees themselves were singing. The whispers merged with the melody, creating a cacophony of dread that made it hard to think. Jane's knees buckled as the journal fell from her hands, landing face up on a page covered in strange symbols. The green light pulsed, and for a fleeting moment she saw something, a figure standing in the distance, shrouded in darkness, with countless crows circling above it like a storm. The figure raised a hand, and the whispers stopped. In the deafening silence, one thought echoed in Jane's mind, not her own but foreign and invasive. "You were always meant to return." Her body trembled as the truth clawed its way to the surface of her thoughts. This wasn't just a random investigation. This forest, the crows, the eerie pull she felt, they were all tied to her bloodline, to her mother's disappearance. She was not just a visitor here. She was part of something far older and far darker than she could have ever imagined. The air around Jane grew colder, thick with a palpable sense of dread. The green light flickered like a taunting beacon, drawing her closer despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But where could she go? The forest had trapped her, the crows watching her every move with unsettling intensity. They seemed to whisper amongst themselves, a chorus of guttural sounds that felt almost like language. Each step toward the light felt like crossing into another reality, one where the rules of the natural world no longer applied. As she emerged into a clearing, her breath caught in her throat. At the center of the space was a grotesque altar made of twisted roots and jagged stones, pulsating faintly with the same eerie green glow. Around it, the crows perched in a perfect circle, their heads tilting in unison as if awaiting her arrival. On the altar lay something that made her stomach churn, a crude carving of a figure, bound in vines that seemed to writhe like living things. Its hollow eye socket stared at her, and its wooden mouth was twisted into a silent scream. Before she could process what she was seeing, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural voice that reverberated through the clearing. It didn't come from any single direction, but seemed to emanate from the forest itself. "You carry the mark. You are the chosen." Jane's heart raced as she clutched the wooden crow tighter, its weight now almost unbearable. The voice continued, deep and resonant, filling her with an unshakable sense of doom. "The pact must be fulfilled. Choose, or the forest will choose for you." The crows parted, and from the shadows stepped a figure, half human, half shadow, its form constantly shifting as though it were struggling to remain corporeal. Its eyes glowed with the same sickly green light, and its elongated fingers dripped with a black, tar-like substance. The entity raised one hand, and with it came a vision that struck Jane like a thunderclap. She saw the missing villagers, their faces frozen in terror, their bodies consumed by the dark roots of the forest. Each of them had made a choice, the voice explained: sacrifice someone they loved to the forest or face eternal torment themselves. The roots held them captive, their twisted forms blending into the grotesque landscape around her. Jane stumbled backward, shaking her head in disbelief. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. But she did understand. The visions were clear. The entity wanted her to make the same choice, to offer someone as a sacrifice to the forest in exchange for her freedom. The voice deepened, dripping with malice. "Bring them here. One life for your own. Or remain with us forever." Jane's mind raced. Who could she possibly bring here? She thought of her closest friends, her family, what remained of it. The faces of people she cared about flashed before her eyes, and the weight of the decision crushed her. The forest didn't care who she chose. It demanded only blood, a life to satiate whatever darkness had taken root here. Then the entity stepped closer, its shifting form becoming more defined. Jane's breath caught as she recognized it, her mother, or at least something wearing her mother's face. It spoke again, its voice layered with the echo of her mother's tone. "You could save me, Jane. One life, and I can return." The words struck her like a dagger. Could it be true? Could this nightmare actually offer her a way to bring her mother back? The rational part of her mind screamed that it was a trick, that this wasn't her mother, but something vile wearing her image. But the hope, however faint, gnawed at her. The crows began to stir, their wings flapping in unison, creating a deafening sound that drowned out her thoughts. The clearing seemed to shrink, the oppressive presence of the forest closing in on her. She felt the weight of the eyes, hundreds of them, pressing down on her, demanding her decision. Finally, the entity extended its hand toward her, black tendrils snaking out to wrap around her wrist. Its touch burned, sending a searing pain through her arm. "Time is fleeting. Choose, Jane. Bring someone to us, or stay and rot with the others." Tears streamed down her face as her mind spiraled into chaos. She couldn't sacrifice someone else, could she? But the alternative was unthinkable. She imagined herself becoming one of the forest's prisoners, her body twisted and broken, her soul bound to this cursed place for eternity. The voice grew louder, relentless. "One life, Jane. You decide." And then, through her panic, she remembered the journal. The phrase scrawled over and over: "The crows are the watchers. The crows are the key." Could the crows hold some other answer, some way to break this cycle without condemning another innocent soul? Jane's eyes darted to the nearest bird, its gaze unwavering. The wooden crow in her hand seemed to pulse again, as if responding to her realization. But the voice of the forest was deafening now, drowning out her thoughts, demanding her choice. The crows began to close in, their black forms merging with the shadows as the entity loomed over her, its hand outstretched. Time was running out, and Jane knew that whatever decision she made, there would be no going back. The clearing grew darker, as if the very light from the sickly green glow was being swallowed by the shadows creeping in from the forest. The crows, now eerily silent, perched on every branch, stump, and stone around Jane, their glossy black eyes reflecting faint glimmers of the flickering light. The air felt heavy, oppressive, pressing against her chest with every breath. It wasn't just the physical darkness, it was something deeper, a presence that seemed to seep into her skin, probing her thoughts and amplifying her fear. Then it began. At first, it was faint, like the sound of leaves rustling in the distance. But soon, the whispers grew clearer, voices layered upon voices, indistinct yet deeply unsettling. They came from every direction, circling her, sliding into her ears and twisting around her mind. The words were fragmented, a language that felt ancient, alien, yet disturbingly familiar. Jane clutched the wooden crow tightly in her hand, its surface now warm, almost alive, pulsing in sync with her racing heart. As the whispers grew louder, they began to take on shapes, distorted words forming in her mind, calling her name, taunting her, and begging her to listen. "Jane, you are part of this. You cannot escape." Each phrase was laced with an undercurrent of malice, a hunger that made her knees weak. She spun around, trying to locate the source of the voices, but the shadows around her writhed like living things, always just out of reach. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A flicker of something humanoid darting between the trees, too fast to be fully seen but slow enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Her breathing hitched as the whispers coalesced into a single, unified voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close. "We see you." The shadows began to shift, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Shapes emerged from the darkness, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes glowed faintly, pinpoints of green light that burned with a malevolent energy. The faces weren't static, they moved, their expressions warping between terror and rage as they whispered directly to her. "Do you know what she did, Jane? Do you know why she left you?" Her stomach turned as the whispers invoked her mother. The memories of her childhood flooded back, her mother's distant gaze, the lullaby that now played faintly in the background, and the crows that had watched her every night. But this time, the memories felt sharper, as though the whispers were pulling at threads she hadn't realized were there. She stumbled backward, only to find herself pressed against the altar, its cold, jagged surface digging into her spine. The shadows surged forward, encircling her, and a cold wind whipped through the clearing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They spoke of betrayal, of sacrifice, of bloodlines tainted by ancient pacts. "She brought you here for a reason. This was always meant to happen." Jane's head spun as she tried to block out the voices, pressing her hands to her ears. But it was no use. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside her, echoing in her mind, gnawing at her sanity. The wooden crow in her hand grew hot, almost scalding, and she instinctively threw it to the ground. The moment it left her grip, the voices stopped. Silence. But it wasn't a relief. It was a vacuum, a void so profound that it made her skin crawl. Slowly, she looked down at the wooden crow, now lying at her feet. Its surface had changed, deep, jagged cracks ran along its body, and its eyes glowed faintly with the same green light as the altar. Before she could react, a tendril of shadow shot out from the ground, wrapping around the wooden figure and pulling it into the earth. The altar began to pulse violently, and the clearing seemed to tilt, the trees around her swaying as though caught in an invisible storm. And then she heard it, a single, sharp whisper, distinct and razor-sharp, slicing through the silence like a blade. "Turn around." Her body froze. Every instinct screamed at her not to obey, but the voice carried an unnatural weight, compelling her against her will. Slowly, trembling, she turned her head. Standing in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was a figure cloaked in shadows. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes burned with a green fire that pierced through her soul. It raised a hand, skeletal and impossibly long, pointing directly at her. The whispers returned, but now they were a deafening roar, each word laced with venom and despair. "You will make the choice. You will join us. You cannot resist." The figure stepped closer, and Jane's vision blurred as her surroundings seemed to dissolve into a swirling mass of shadow and light. The crows took flight, their wings beating in chaotic unison, forming a vortex around her. The world spun, and the altar began to glow brighter, its light revealing grotesque carvings of human faces, twisted in agony, etched deep into its surface. Jane fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the oppressive weight of the forest and the whispers clawing at her sanity. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure loomed over her now, its presence suffocating, as it extended a hand toward her. "You were always meant to be here, Jane. Accept it." The crows landed around her once more, their black eyes now glowing green. Jane felt the cold touch of the figure's hand on her forehead, and in that moment, she saw everything: her mother's sacrifice, the pact that bound her family to this cursed place, and her own fate, sealed long before she ever set foot in Windmere. The shadows engulfed her, and the world went dark. The world around Jane felt like it had unraveled, plunging her into an abyss where time and space no longer had meaning. Her breaths came shallow and fast, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. The oppressive darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that seemed to seep into her very being. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow worse. Every sound she made, her labored breathing, the faint shuffle of her feet, echoed back unnaturally, as if the forest itself was mocking her. Then, without warning, the whispers returned, not from the outside, but within her own mind. They spoke directly to her fears, pulling at the fragile threads of her sanity. "Do you see now, Jane? Do you feel it? This is what you were always running from." The words carried a weight that made her knees tremble. They weren't just speaking to her, They were unearthing every buried fear, every hidden guilt, every regret she had tried to forget. As she stumbled forward, a faint light pierced the darkness ahead, flickering like a dying ember. It illuminated a twisted scene. An old wooden mirror, cracked and tarnished, stood alone in the middle of the void. Jane hesitated, every fiber of her being screaming for her to turn away, but the mirror called to her, pulling her closer with an almost magnetic force. When she finally stood before it, her reflection was wrong. Her eyes, usually full of determination, were sunken and hollow, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light that had haunted her since she entered the forest. The image in the mirror smirked at her, a cruel, knowing smile that sent chills down her spine. "You can't hide from me, Jane," the reflection whispered, its lips moving in perfect synchronization with her own. "I know what you've done. I know what you fear." The reflection began to shift, morphing into the faces of people she had loved and lost. Her mother, staring at her with a mixture of sorrow and accusation. Her childhood friend Emily, who had vanished one summer after wandering into the woods. And finally, herself as a child, clutching the same wooden crow that had led her here. The child's voice rang out, high-pitched and trembling. "Why didn't you save us, Jane? Why did you let us go?" The question struck her like a blow, dredging up memories she had long since buried. Nights spent staring out her bedroom window, waiting for her mother to come home, and the crushing guilt of not doing more to find Emily when she disappeared. The mirror darkened, and the whispers intensified, overlapping and growing louder until they became a cacophony. Words and phrases cut through her like shards of glass. "Coward. Betrayer. You were always meant to fail." Jane dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the whispers clawed at her mind. But then, through the chaos, a new voice emerged, calm, soothing, yet dripping with malice. "It doesn't have to be this way, Jane," the voice said, smooth and serpentine. "You can end the pain. You can end the guilt. All it takes is one choice." The darkness around her shifted, and suddenly, she was no longer in the void. She stood in her childhood bedroom, the air thick with the scent of lavender and the faint hum of her mother's lullaby. Outside the window, 3 crows perched on the sill, their eyes glowing faintly. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, her back to Jane. Slowly she turned, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. "You could have saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "You can still save me." Jane's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know what to do." Her mother stood, stepping closer, her movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "You know now," she said, her voice growing sharper, more insistent. "You can fix this. You can bring me back." The scene shifted again, and Jane was back in the clearing. The altar stood before her, glowing brighter now, its grotesque carvings more vivid. The voice returned, stronger, more seductive. "One life, Jane. One simple sacrifice. You hold the power in your hands. Imagine their faces. Imagine the joy, the relief. Isn't that what you want? Isn't that what they deserve?" The wooden crow appeared in her hand once more, its surface now smooth and warm, almost comforting. The whispers subsided, leaving only the voice and her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The crows around her seemed to lean closer, their black eyes reflecting her image 1,000 times over. The choice loomed over her like a storm cloud. Sacrificing someone would end this torment, would bring her mother back, would erase the guilt that had haunted her for years. But the price was unthinkable. The voice pressed on, relentless. "Do it, Jane. You know it's the only way. Or would you rather join them? Would you rather let the guilt consume you forever?" As the altar pulsed, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, becoming unstable. The forest itself seemed to breathe, its presence suffocating her as the weight of the decision bore down on her. She clutched the wooden crow tighter, feeling its warmth seep into her skin, and realized with a chilling certainty that no matter what she chose, she would never leave this place unscarred. The air around Jane thickened, pressing against her like a heavy, invisible force. The forest seemed to close in, its shadows alive with anticipation. The crows shifted uneasily in their perches, their heads tilting in perfect unison as if they, too, awaited her decision. The altar's green glow intensified, illuminating the twisted carvings of anguished faces that seemed to writhe against the stone. The whispers had become a low, rhythmic chant, their syllables pulsing in her mind like a dark heartbeat. Jane stood frozen, the wooden crow burning hot in her hand. The entity loomed before her now, its form more defined but still shrouded in shifting shadows. Its skeletal fingers stretched out toward her, beckoning her forward. Its voice was a venomous whisper, cutting through the growing noise around her. It is time, Jane. The pact must be fulfilled. Choose. Her legs felt weak, trembling as though they might give out beneath her. The faces in the forest's shadows grew sharper, their hollow eyes staring into her soul, their mouths twisted into soundless screams. One by one, they emerged further into the dim light, figures of the past. Her mother stood among them, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes pleading. Beside her was Emily, her childhood friend, clutching a withered flower in her small hand. Others she didn't recognize appeared as well, their forms mangled, as if they had been claimed by the forest long ago. "Do it, Jane," her mother's voice echoed. "Save me. Save yourself." The words hit her like a tidal wave, drowning her in guilt and desperation. Her mind spiraled, torn between the hope of bringing her mother back and the horror of what the sacrifice would mean. The entity stepped closer, its hollow eyes blazing with green fire. Its voice was patient but insistent. "One life for another. This is the way of things. You have the power to end this torment." Jane's heart pounded as she fell to her knees before the altar. The wooden crow seemed to pulse in her grip, each beat synchronizing with her racing heart. Tears blurred her vision as she thought of the faces she had seen, the lives lost to this cursed place. But what could she do? Was it truly her choice to make, or had it already been decided long before she stepped into these woods? As her mind raced, the ground beneath her shifted, and the carvings on the altar began to glow brighter. The anguished faces etched into the stone turned toward her, their mouths opening in unison to release an unearthly wail. The sound tore through her, sharp and relentless, drowning out her thoughts and leaving only the voice of the entity. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You were born for this moment." Suddenly, the wooden crow cracked in her hand, splitting into two jagged pieces. From the broken wood seeped a thick, black mist that spiraled upward, coalescing into a swirling vortex above the altar. The shadows around her writhed and twisted, forming the faces of those who had come before her, their mouths moving in silent pleas. And then she saw it, the truth. The faces weren't just victims, they were the ones who had made the choice, who had sacrificed others to save themselves. Their eyes burned with the weight of their guilt, and their twisted forms showed the price of their betrayal. They hadn't escaped. They had only traded one torment for another. The entity's voice cut through her realization. "See their fates? Yours need not be the same. Choose wisely, Jane. You have the power to break the cycle, or to continue it." Her hands trembled as she stared at the broken pieces of the wooden crow. The choice hung before her like a noose, tightening with every second. She could feel the forest watching, its dark energy pressing down on her, waiting for her decision. Finally, she stood, her knees weak but her resolve hardening. She met the entity's burning gaze, her voice trembling but firm. "No," she whispered, her words barely audible but filled with defiance. "I won't do it. I won't become like them." The forest roared in fury, the shadows surging forward like waves, and the altar erupted in a blinding light. Jane braced herself as the ground beneath her cracked and splintered, the earth groaning as if the forest itself was protesting her defiance. The crows took to the sky in a chaotic storm, their cries piercing the air. The entity's form wavered, its burning eyes narrowing in anger. "Foolish child," it hissed, its voice now a guttural growl. "You think you can deny me? You think you can escape?" Jane clutched the broken pieces of the crow tightly as the shadows engulfed her. The whispers returned, louder and more venomous, clawing at her mind. But through the chaos, she held on to one thought. She would not let the forest claim her. The light from the altar surged one final time, and everything went black. When Jane opened her eyes, she was lying on the forest floor. The clearing was empty, the altar gone. The crows were nowhere to be seen, and the oppressive darkness had lifted. But the wooden crow pieces remained in her hands, their surfaces now etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly. She staggered to her feet, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The forest was quiet now, but it wasn't peaceful. The air still carried the weight of something ancient, something waiting. As Jane made her way back toward the path, she felt the eyes of the forest on her, and she knew the choice she had made would haunt her forever. The whispers were gone, but in the silence, she could still feel them, lingering at the edge of her mind. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The clearing was alive with an unnatural energy, the shadows around Jane twisting and writhing like serpents ready to strike. The altar before her pulsed with an ominous green light, and the forest seemed to breathe, each inhalation drawing her deeper into despair. The whispers in her mind were no longer fragmented. They had grown into a unified voice, clear and commanding, drowning out all other thoughts. "Jane," the voice intoned, low and guttural, as if the forest itself were speaking. "You have carried the mark. You were chosen. Fulfill your destiny." Her legs felt like lead, her body weighed down by fear and the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded her. The carved faces on the altar seemed to move now, their expressions shifting between torment and malice, their hollow eyes staring directly into hers. The crows perched around the clearing were utterly still, their black eyes reflecting the sickly glow of the altar. It was as though the entire forest was waiting, holding its breath for her decision. From the shifting shadows stepped the entity. Its form was clearer now, tall and gaunt, its body a mixture of sinewy darkness and jagged edges that scraped against reality itself. Its face was a blank, smooth void, save for two burning green eyes that pierced through her very soul. It extended a skeletal hand toward her, its fingers impossibly long, tipped with claws that glistened like obsidian. "One life," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the clearing. "One life is all it takes to end this. The blood binds the pact. The choice is yours." Jane's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but the weight of the decision bore down on her like a crushing wave. The whispers around her grew louder, mocking her hesitation. "You cannot escape," they taunted. "This is your fate." The entity stepped closer, and the shadows around it stretched toward Jane, their tendrils brushing against her skin like icy fingers. The wooden crow in her hand began to heat up, its surface glowing faintly. The symbols etched into it pulsed in time with the light from the altar, as if the object itself were alive and urging her toward the altar. "Think of what you've lost," the entity said, its voice now softer, almost soothing. "Think of your mother. Think of the years you've spent searching for answers. This is the way to end it. This is the way to bring her back." The words struck her like a blow, and her vision blurred as memories surfaced, her mother's face, her laughter, the lullabies she used to sing. Jane's heart ached with longing, and for a moment, she felt the temptation tugging at her resolve. If one life could bring her mother back, could end this nightmare, was it worth it? But then she saw the faces on the altar again. They twisted and writhed, their mouths opening in soundless screams. The truth hit her like a thunderclap. These were the faces of others who had made the same choice, who had sacrificed others in a desperate attempt to escape the forest's curse. They had not been freed, they had been consumed, their souls bound to this cursed place for eternity. The realization sent a surge of cold terror through her. This wasn't a choice, it was a trap. "What will it be, Jane?" the entity asked, its tone growing sharper, more impatient. "Choose, or the forest will choose for you." The shadows around her surged forward, wrapping around her wrists and ankles like chains, dragging her closer to the altar. The faces on its surface began to chant in unison, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. Jane struggled, her voice shaking as she shouted, "No, I won't do it." The forest roared in response, the crows taking to the air in a flurry of black feathers, their cries deafening. The entity's eyes burned brighter, and its voice became a thunderous growl. "You defy me? You dare to break the cycle?" The shadows tightened their grip, pulling her toward the altar, and the wooden crow in her hand cracked, splitting into jagged pieces. From the cracks spilled a blinding white light that cut through the darkness, forcing the shadows to recoil. The entity let out an ear-piercing screech, its form flickering and distorting as the light engulfed the clearing. Jane held the broken pieces of the wooden crow tightly, her hands trembling but resolute. "You will not escape me, Jane," the entity snarled as its form began to dissolve. "You may run, but this is not the end. The forest will always call you back." The light grew brighter, consuming everything around her. The last thing she saw was the altar crumbling, the faces on its surface fading into nothingness. When the light faded, Jane found herself lying on the ground, the forest eerily quiet. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a cold, still air that carried no sound. The wooden crow was gone, its pieces reduced to ash that slipped through her fingers. She staggered to her feet, her body aching and her mind reeling. The clearing was empty now, the altar nothing more than a pile of rubble. The crows were gone, their absence as unsettling as their presence had been. But as Jane turned to leave, she felt it, a faint whisper at the edge of her mind, a reminder that the forest's grip was not entirely broken. She had survived, but the cost was yet to be revealed. And deep down, she knew the forest would never truly let her go. The air around Jane grew unnervingly still, the silence oppressive and suffocating. The shadows that had once swirled around her now coiled tightly, wrapping the clearing in an impenetrable darkness. The entity, no longer flickering and vague, emerged from the gloom in its full form. Its towering figure was a grotesque amalgamation of sinew, shadow, and jagged bone, its limbs unnaturally long, clawed, and sharp. The green light of its hollow eyes burned brighter than ever, casting an eerie glow across the altar's crumbled remains. "You think this is over, Jane?" the entity hissed, its voice a blend of rage and mockery. "You think you can defy me and walk away unscathed?" Jane's breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered backward, her legs weak from the overwhelming sense of doom that emanated from the creature. The broken fragments of the wooden crow were gone, disintegrated into ash, leaving her with nothing but her resolve and a faint flicker of hope. The entity's presence pressed against her like a storm, its shadowy tendrils curling toward her, each one radiating cold, unrelenting malice. "You will not leave this place alive," it snarled, stepping closer, each movement sending tremors through the ground. "The forest demands its price, and you will pay it, either with your soul or with another's." Jane's mind raced. She had no weapon, no protection, and no idea how to fight something so ancient and powerful. But then she remembered the faces on the altar, the voices of the forest's past victims, and the sacrifice they had made to prolong their torment. The truth struck her with chilling clarity. The entity's power was rooted in fear, in the choices it forced others to make. "You feed on this, don't you?" she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You thrive on our terror, on our desperation." The entity's form wavered for a moment, as if her words had struck a nerve. But its eyes burned brighter, and it let out a guttural laugh that sent shivers down her spine. "And what will you do with this knowledge, Jane?" it taunted. "Knowing changes nothing. You are still mine." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around her ankles and wrists, pulling her toward the altar's remains. Jane cried out, struggling against their grip, but the tendrils of darkness were unyielding, cold and sharp as they sliced into her skin. The crows returned, their cries echoing in the distance, growing louder and more frenzied as they circled above. The forest began to shift, its trees twisting unnaturally, their branches bending toward her like grasping fingers. The ground beneath her cracked and splintered, glowing faintly with the same green light as the altar. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, each one cutting into her mind like a blade. "You cannot fight this," the entity growled, its voice rising in intensity. "You were born for this moment, Jane. You were chosen to continue the cycle. Give in, and it will all be over." Through the cacophony, Jane's thoughts sharpened. The entity's words confirmed what she had begun to suspect. It wasn't invincible. It relied on its victims' submission, on their belief that they had no other choice. She gritted her teeth, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. "No," she whispered at first, then louder. "I won't give you what you want." The shadows tightened around her, the entity's rage palpable. It lunged toward her, its clawed hand outstretched, aiming for her chest. Jane acted on instinct, ducking and rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding its attack. The altar's remnants glowed brighter, the air around it rippling with energy, as if the forest itself was reacting to her defiance. Her gaze darted to the ground where the wooden crow had shattered. The ash from its remains shimmered faintly, forming a symbol she didn't recognize but instinctively understood. Without hesitation, she knelt and pressed her hand to the glowing sigil, the warmth of the light surging through her like fire. The entity screamed, a sound so inhuman and piercing that it seemed to shake the entire forest. The shadows recoiled, and the tendrils binding her disintegrated into wisps of smoke. The green light in its eyes flickered, dimming as the sigil's glow intensified. "You cannot destroy me," it roared, its voice desperate and fractured. "I am eternal. I am the forest." Jane stood, the sigil's light now enveloping her like a shield. She stepped forward, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. "You are nothing without us," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "You are only as powerful as the fear you create. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." With those words, the sigil's light exploded outward, engulfing the clearing in a blinding brilliance. The entity let out one final, agonized scream as its form dissolved, its shadowy body torn apart by the radiant energy. The crows scattered, their cries fading into the distance, and the forest fell deathly silent. When the light faded, Jane stood alone in the clearing. The altar was gone, reduced to a pile of crumbled stone, and the sigil on the ground had vanished. The oppressive weight of the forest was lifted, replaced by a fragile stillness. But as she turned to leave, she felt a faint whisper brush against her mind, so quiet it was almost imperceptible. "This is not the end, Jane. The forest always remembers. She shuddered but kept walking, her steps unsteady but determined. The path that had disappeared earlier now lay before her, leading her back to the edge of the woods. As she stepped out of the forest, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. But Jane knew the forest's darkness lingered, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. Jane stepped out of the forest, her body trembling and her mind heavy with exhaustion. The first rays of dawn broke through the horizon, bathing the landscape in a golden glow that felt alien after the suffocating darkness she had endured. The world outside seemed unchanged, peaceful even, as if the horrors she had faced were nothing more than a nightmare. But Jane knew better. The forest, though silent now, had not truly let her go. It had simply released her for the time being. Her boots crunched on the gravel path as she walked back to her car, which sat exactly where she had left it, untouched. She opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The engine roared to life, but before she could drive away, she noticed something in the rearview mirror. A single crow sat perched on a distant branch, its black eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, she thought she could see a faint green glow in its gaze, a reminder of the entity she had faced. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, but the unease lingered. The forest was behind her now, yet its presence still felt oppressive, like a shadow clinging to her every move. As Jane drove away, flashes of what had transpired invaded her thoughts. The shifting shadows, the grotesque faces on the altar, the entity's burning eyes. No matter how hard she tried to focus on the road ahead, the memories refused to fade. Her fingers brushed against her palm, searching for the wooden crow that had been her anchor throughout the ordeal. But it was gone, reduced to ash in the clearing. Yet, she could still feel its weight, as if its essence had imprinted itself on her soul. When she finally reached her apartment, Jane stepped inside and locked the door behind her, leaning against it for support. The familiar surroundings brought a brief sense of comfort, but it was fleeting. The air inside felt different, colder somehow, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker. She turned on every light, but the unease only grew. Sitting at her desk, Jane opened her laptop, desperate to make sense of what she had experienced. She searched for any mention of the forest, the entity, or the curse, but the results were sparse, fragmented accounts from locals who spoke in cryptic terms about disappearances and hauntings. One article mentioned a Watcher's Pact, an ancient agreement made by villagers centuries ago to protect themselves from something far worse. The words sent a chill down her spine. The pact wasn't just about fear, it was about power. The forest had become a vessel for something older than human memory, a force that thrived on choices, guilt, and sacrifice. And now, Jane realized, she had become a part of its history. Her gaze fell to her desk where a small, strange object rested, a piece of blackened wood, its edges jagged and cracked. She didn't remember bringing it with her, but there it was, a fragment of the wooden crow. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing against its rough surface. The moment she touched it, a faint whisper echoed in her mind. "It isn't over, Jane." She recoiled, dropping the fragment onto the desk, her heart pounding. The room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer, pressing against the edges of her vision. She tried to steady her breathing, but the whisper came again, louder this time, layered with voices, some familiar, others alien. "You broke the cycle, but you did not end it. The forest waits, and it will call again." Jane backed away, her hands trembling, but her eyes remained locked on the fragment. It began to glow faintly, a sickly green light that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. The same chant she had heard in the forest returned, faint but unmistakable, growing louder with each passing moment. Desperate, she grabbed the fragment and flung it across the room, but it didn't shatter. Instead, it landed upright on the floor, its glow intensifying. The shadows around it deepened, stretching toward her like tendrils. Suddenly, the lights in her apartment flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Jane froze, her breath hitching as a familiar presence filled the room. The air grew cold, and the faint sound of wings flapping echoed around her. "You think you're free?" the voice whispered, dripping with malice. "You carry the mark. You will always belong to us." A single green eye opened in the darkness, followed by another and another, until the room was filled with burning, unblinking eyes staring directly at her. Jane screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows, leaving only silence. When the lights returned, the fragment was gone, and the room was still. Jane collapsed to the floor, her body shaking as tears streamed down her face. She knew then that the forest wasn't done with her. It had let her leave, but not without leaving a piece of itself inside her. From that day forward, Jane's life was plagued by subtle but unmistakable signs of the forest's lingering presence. The caw of a crow in the distance would send her heart racing. Shadows in her apartment moved when they shouldn't. And at night, she would hear faint whispers in her dreams, calling her name, reminding her that the forest always remembers. She tried to move on, but the truth was inescapable. The forest had marked her, and the entity was patient. It didn't need to chase her. It only needed to wait, because eventually, Jane would have to return. And when she did, the choice she had made would come full circle, revealing the cost of defiance in a place where no one ever truly escapes. The forest was still watching,